welcome to a special edition of the State of the Grizz. I am your co-host, Charles Pryor, and I have the pleasure of serving as the interim vice president for student engagement. My partner in crime is under the weather today. So Mr. Nestor Melendez, our director of student leadership and campus life, can't be here. We wish him a speedy recovery. And make sure you listen to and follow Dr. Mama's instructions so that you can be back with us in a couple of weeks. Today's episode is extremely special to me for a number of reasons. Every week I wear a t-shirt that I want to share the meaning of. Today's t-shirt is Teach, Hustle, Inspire. It's a book and a movement, really, by one of my former students, a guy by the name of Dr. Sean Woodley. Sean was one of my students 22 or 23 years ago. And, awesome individual, doing a lot of work around culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally responsive leadership. He has a book out, but this isn't, to peddle his stuff, but more so to talk about what this means to me when I see it. Like I said, he's a former student of mine. So when I look at Teach, Hustle, Inspire, it reminds me that we are leaders, we are educators, and we are always looking for and hopefully capitalizing on our teachable moments that we have with our students. You want to show some hustle, you want to show some get after it. Of course, growing up in my neighborhood, hustle meant a number of things, but it was always about working hard. And nothing negative, just really, about applying yourself. And if you're always teaching, always capitalizing on those teachable moments, you're always pushing, working hard, you are destined to inspire. So Dr. Woodley inspires me. And I hope that at some point in my career at Gutman, I inspire some of you. So that's why I'm wearing this shirt today. But one of the other reasons, because there are multiple, that this edition of the State of the Grizz is important to me is Veterans Day. And I honor our veterans. I have a number of veterans in my family. My father's a veteran. He saw live action. My uncles, I have a number of them that were veterans, especially my Uncle James, who helped raise me. He's passed on, and my brother was a vet. And there's a lot that veterans give. I say all gave some, and some gave it all. So I want to take this moment to thank all of those that have served in the armed forces, and just say I respect and appreciate everything that you have given up for the freedoms that we fight for in this country. And I say that we fight for, that you fought for, but we are continuing to fight. As my colleague and partner in crime today, Ms. Carolee Ramsey, and I will really get a chance to talk about, because we're 8 days out from the last day to vote in the general election, and about 3.5 days out from when that election, at least on a national scale, was called officially. Though there are some rumblings about the incumbent not accepting the outcome, but we're not, we're not here to pick sides. Though I think everyone is clear, who I voted for. I'm not going to make any bones about that, right, Carolee? We don't make bones about that. I think it's clear, who I voted for, and you'll see, in more of my t-shirts this year to make it clear where I stand on a number of issues. Absolutely. But I absolutely do believe that we right now have a leadership gap in our country on multiple levels. I don't necessarily 100% agree even with the candidates that I chose, but I picked what I thought was best to lead this country based on the options that I have. You know what I mean? And I trust that my vote for them ensures that they will continue to represent the things that they promised us in their campaigns. And if not, guess what? I have a choice in 4 years to vote them out. You know what I mean? Just like you do with your governors, your mayors, your state legislators, your U.S. representatives and so forth and so on. But like I said, we're going to get into that. So I want to thank and introduce Miss Carolee Ramsey, who is our Associate Director for Student Conduct and Community Standards. Ms. Ramsey has been with Gutman since there was a Gutman, since before there was a Gutman, actually. Now that I think about it, when Gutman was monikered the new community college. So Carolee, thank
Right.
you so much.
True.
You know,
I forgot
welcome
that.
to State of the Grizz. You know, you can't go without saying it. You know, because you are one of the folks, as they say, that laid the foundation bricks for the institution, for the division, and you know, you have roots in our inaugural class. So thank you and welcome to State of the Grizz. How are you today?
Thank you, VP Pryor. I am well. I just went out to take a break, but the rain came down, and so I was trying to hustle back, but not. I couldn't do it as fast as I wanted to. How's everyone feeling? I can't.
You know,
I know I saw Julia say hi. Great,
yeah.
Julia. Um, we've had some conversations during this election cycle with students. I'm not too sure that everyone who we have talked to before has been on those chats and those meetings, but we've had some really, really great expressions from students. You know, it was kind of heartening to know what students were feeling, and like students are just like us. They were feeling sometimes anxiety, and they were feeling a little pressure, and they were feeling civically engaged. So although VP Pryor introduced me as the Associate Director of Student Conduct, I want to go back a little bit, just put on my hat as a teacher. I was a former lecturer of government and politics. And so because of that, I like to put on that hat when it comes on to especially presidential election, where more people are engaged, and unfortunately would like you to be engaged at the local level, but I find that more students are engaged at the presidential election level. So I just want to ask people just a question, like, how are you feeling? Because that is important.
Yeah, you know, Carolee, one thing to keep in mind, we do have some students here, but most folks are going to watch this in a tape delay.
Oh, okay.
You know what I mean? So,
Got you.
you know, I
Okay.
know our earlier editions of the State of the Grizz, we did have
Right.
larger live audiences, but,
Okay.
you know, as we've moved to asynchronous coursework, you know, it just seems that that's the
Right.
way folks
That's
are
fine.
plugging in. We do have a number of folks in the space, and they are more than welcome to write into the chat.
Right.
But by and large, the you know, folks are going to watch this in tape delay.
Right. So I wanted to ask that question just to say, how are you feeling? Because I feel like it's been such a long process. And as VP Pryor said, we're still not 100% settled. Although some networks have called the election, we have gotten to 270 electoral college votes, and some networks have projected a winner. But there are some challenges, and people have still not conceded. So I wanted to talk just about the anxiety that people experience, because I am an advisor to the student group Spark, students promoting attitudes of kindness and respect. And one of the things that we constantly talk about is just the stress. Because one thing we wanted to make sure is that everyone in the group knows that we were there for each other, like we had their back. the college was being supportive or whatever students were feeling. Plus, as a little mini group, we had each other's back. And
Right.
it was very disheartening for me for students to say that they are developing a post-election safety plan. In all my years of higher education, and I've been in higher education longer than I want to tell you, but in all my years of higher education, I have never had an election cycle that happens and students say, you know what, I'm developing a safety plan because this is how bad it is.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that safety plan was because they heard, based on their groups, whatever groups they were tuning into on social media, or just in their chats, they heard that there was going to be a civil war because people were not going to be accepting of the results of the election. So it was like people on the left not being accepted and people on the right not being accepted. So it sparked a conversation for me, like, how do we live through this election incivility? Because this election, more than anything else, we had more participation, but there was more incivility. And we at in Spark, that student group, were more focused on being civil to each other. But how do we disagree, even though how do we disagree in a civil way? And so
Carolee, I don't mean to
yes.
cut you off, but you're hitting on some real important topics, and I want to kind of flesh those out. You know what I mean? Like you said, we had folks that were planning for safety after the
Absolutely.
election. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we
Mm-hmm.
can talk about that for an hour, but I think
Right.
what all in its own. But I think one of the things that you are hitting on right now is this what does healthy discussion, dialogue, and discourse look like, feel like? How do we facilitate it? How do we manage it? But also, one of the things that I always attempt to do, and I don't do it well, all the time. I think I do it well sometimes, is check our own feelings and emotions so that I can have a conversation based on facts and be analytical and not be emotional, because it's really tough to talk about things that were really frontline issues
Mm-hmm.
from an emotional standpoint and have a
Mm-hmm.
civil conversation. I rarely see emotions high and civility
Mm-hmm.
intact.
Mm-hmm.
You know
Yes.
what I mean?
Yes.
What are you all talking about around that with, emotions are high? How do you keep civility in spaces when you're having discussion again about kind of, I'm going to say, high octane issues?
Well, one of the major things that we focus on is how can you form common ground, because
Mm,
there's always common ground. And so um, yes, everybody's trying to persuade you to see his or her side, but at the same time, you have to know, as you said, you check your biases because of
mm-hmm,
your
mm-hmm,
emotion and your background, and also check what is the opinion versus fact. So let's
mm,
talk about our opinions and let's
mm-hmm,
talk about the facts that support our opinion. And how can we find common ground? So, for example, one of the things that we talked about in the group is what issues during this election cycle were important to you. We came up with many of them, as you can
mm-hmm,
imagine.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Racial justice kept coming up, because race is one of our first identity. And so
right,
race keep coming up, and we said, okay, so let's talk about racial justice.
mm-hmm,
Let's talk about what each side is saying about racial justice. What are our own value system? What informs those values? And who is speaking more to your value system than not? So when you talk about racial justice, for example, one of the greatest thing during this election was the amount of Black people and other people of color that were not feeling like they have that kind of equality as it come on to police interactions. So how do we go forward? What do we do? I had students, for example, in the heat of the Black Lives Matter protests, and they were like, we have to do this. There is a pandemic, which again has its own problems in terms of the people it affects, in terms of the groups it affects. But we have a pandemic, but we have to do this. And so we had students going out, we had students joining the protests in New York City, and we had students saying, wow, you know, all this matters because if I remain quiet, then I am complicit in this. And so we had students helping each other in terms of saying where they should meet. We had students bringing masks for each other. And so on. So I mean, that is the kind of student spirit that we had at Gutman. Well, not many people know about it because it was not widely advertised. But then we said, okay, let's talk about racial equality as it relates to law enforcement and our interactions with law enforcement. And so some people went on one campaign had this law and order. They're on the side of law and order. So I brought the conversation back to, okay, can we have law and order as well as racial equality? And so when we talk about that, we started to find common ground.
So, one of the things I'm interested in, and, just, go with me if you can, is what do people think is law and order? You know what I mean? Because one of the things that I think I struggle with is I absolutely believe in safety. You know what I mean? I absolutely
we work in
believe
safety, Charles.
Hello, you know what I mean? Like that's the gig, because people don't learn in places where they don't feel safe. Because you got to let your guard down and be vulnerable to ask questions. So there's a emotional safety and a physical safety that has to be met. But when I look at what the safest communities have, they have resources. They have less police. They have more resources. So I always wonder, and I went to college in the early 90s. I'm old enough to remember the crime bill that the Clintons put forward, and things like that. So, and I wonder what the thinking is when people talk about law and order, because I think about opportunities for engagement and how that creates order more than and mind you, I mean, I have to say this, I believe in prosecuting the cops that killed Breonna Taylor. You know what I mean? I believe that Walter Wallace Jr. should still be alive. You know what I mean? Eric Garner should still be alive. I believe all that. But I also have a brother who works in the 75th precinct in Brooklyn, New York. You know what I mean? He's been a cop for 16 years. I have another brother that's a New York State trooper. I have a cousin who's an FBI agent. So I have things on both sides, but I absolutely believe that those young Black people should still be alive.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I would love to hear what the conversations and discussions were around law and order.
Well, for the most part, the messaging, again, let me go back to the campaign messaging. The campaign messaging, on one hand, was saying mostly defund the
Mm-hmm.
police. On the other hand, on the other side of the ideological spectrum, is that
Mm-hmm.
we need the police, and so we need we need all those boots on the ground. For example,
Mm-hmm.
when the protests were happening, and then the protests become riots. I know how I feel about riots, but when the
Mm-hmm.
protests become riots and looting and burning was happening, there were people saying, well, that's why we need the police. We need to send in more reinforcement. We need to send in federal troops. We need to send in state police, and so on. What I gather from the conversations I had, because I was asking, how can we find racial justice and still have law and order? What I gather is that people saw law and order as more policing, and more policing in their mind meant
Mm-hmm.
more racial distrust,
Right.
more racial inequity as it
Mm-hmm.
comes into our interactions with the police. And again, our students are young. Most of them
Mm-hmm.
are young people of color. So their interaction with the police, or in their community, other people's interaction with the police may not be what someone else from a different community experience. And
Mm-hmm.
so most of them were saying, they agree with the police should be prosecuted. The police should be held accountable. The police unions are too strong
Mm-hmm.
because under normal circumstances, many people would have been prosecuted for having in the process of their duty, having
Right.
their knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
Absolutely. One of the things when I think about, protests that got turned, and I'm not saying turned, I'm saying got turned into riots
Yes.
purposely. It's not a play on words. It's what I think happened. I
Yes.
think about over the summer, and early spring, when there were white nationalist groups walking down the streets armed with AK-47 and other attack style rifles and weapons. There was no rush to have an overwhelming number of police out there to control it. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I mean? And they had weapons out brandishing them, but there was very little police presence, and that happened in multiple states. I don't think it happened in New York. I think in New York
No,
City we
because we're not
reacted. It,
open
it
carry. Yeah.
right. I was about to say no one can walk down the street holding a gun. You know what I mean? Even detectives got to cover them up. But my
Mm-hmm.
point is, and there are studies about this, so I don't mean to be leading, though it's going to sound like I'm leading. Why is it that certain protests require police and certain protests don't? Even when the ones that don't, overwhelmingly, not always, but overwhelmingly, have open weapons being carried with them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so how do we reconcile that? How do we negotiate that going forward for our students and for ourselves? Because that's one of the things that I struggle with. Because like your students, I did have some concern about what the reaction from the right would be if the election went the way that it went. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Especially when the president, and I watched the clip again because I was like, maybe I misheard it, maybe people are misquoting, because that happens on both sides of the media. But he did tell the Proud Boys, stand down and stand by.
Right.
And I'm not, and I don't want to, say officially what it meant, but what I heard, and this is what I heard, you know what I mean, my stuff is wait and see what happens before you react. But react, because stand by means be on the ready.
Right.
You know what I mean? And again, that's what I heard. I don't know if they heard it that way or what, but when you talk about, like you said, the protests that get turned into riots, how we feel about riots is one thing, but I think that there are elements that manipulate protests into riots. You know?
Right. And then we when you look at Kyle Rittenhouse, for example, that young man from another state who went to another state just by hearing that messaging, went to another state and he shot 3 people. And he walked back to the police.
Carrying his weapon.
Right. And he carried his weapon and he was protected. And up to this day, there are people in our leadership still protecting him. And so, you know, our young people are watching and looking at that. So I said, in my interactions with students, I said, let's peel back the onion. I do not support the violence. However, historically, if Black and brown people have not burned down places, right, where the capital, which means the money is being affected, then sometimes there is no spotlight shown on their issue. And I'm going to say I'm not supporting violence. And I also think there were many people who started violence, started looting, started burning, who were not part of the protests.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, there's an old African proverb. And again, like you, I'm not advocating for violence in any, I am advocating for disruption. I am advocating for
good trouble.
Absolute word. But there's an old African proverb that says a child not loved by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth.
Wow.
You know what I'm saying? That's out there. You know what I mean?
Very true.
And the truth is, for the African diaspora up and down the Americas, we could never loot what they have, the equivalent to what they have stolen from us. We just couldn't. You know what I mean? So this isn't about, you know, getting even, because we never could. You know, Jalen Rose said in a quote, and one of my big brothers read it to me the other day, they got 400 plus years head start. We're just now having, you know, open conversations, like you said, about like this discourse. But even within that, there is justification of, you know, 8 minutes and 46 seconds of being on someone's neck. You know, like how could you imagine? There is in the Minneapolis, a white police officer, and I wish I had his name. I'm thankful that you took it here, who accidentally, in the middle of a shooting that was deemed appropriate, but he accidentally struck and killed a white woman. The officer was Black. He was justified in the shooting, but unfortunately, bullets don't listen to where you want them to go. And he accidentally murdered a white woman. Family sued, they got money, he's in jail. You know what I mean? Truly an accident.
Right.
But he's serving time in a penal institution. You know, and we are, you know, at a state where, or at a phase with George Floyd, where the cop is where now? Is he in jail? You know, there's a GoFundMe for his legal defense.
Yes.
And, you know, people surrounded his house, and, you know, he's in protective custody because of the scrutiny that he's received, but he's not in jail. You know
And
what I
what
mean?
really came to the front is that Black and brown peoples we're not asking for more than another group. We're just asking for a fair share. And so that came out a lot for students. And so I said, even with, as you mentioned, bullets strayed and hit someone who was not Black, and that person is locked up. Even in Breonna Taylor's case, the grand jury was asked to consider that the charges be filed because, not because the cop's bullet killed Breonna Taylor, but because it went to a white person's apartment. And so they endangered that person's life. And I know that case is still ongoing. But, you know, when young people, I'm going back to my point, young people are watching. And the way how they're watching is, it leaves a lot to be desired. We talked about defunding the police and what that means, because there were those words going around. And to be honest, a lot of support came for the other side who was against defunding the police, not from my student groups, but in the election. You saw a lot of support because messaging is also important. What does that mean? And I know we're young and Generation Z and they're woke and so on, but we have to be careful with messaging. Defund the police. In seeking our fair share, what does it mean to defund the police? And many of our young people took it literally.
Absolutely. I mean, and like you said, you know, one of the things about the Twitter generation, you know what I mean, is that they try to have, and maybe too often, catchphrases, things that you can hold on to, so that people remember it, because we live our life now based on 160 characters.
Right.
But the truth is, the defund the police initiative is not about fully dismantling the police. It's about shifting resources, because we now ask the police to show up in places that they should not. You know, the idea that Walter Wallace Jr. died because he was having a mental, an episode where his mental health was fractured in the moment, is problematic. Why? Because 911 automatically routed the police. I can remember when I was a hall director in 99 or 2000. It was 20 something years ago, when we realized that every time that we called 911 for an ambulance, the police showed up. And I remember talking to one of the officers. He was a brother. He and I had made a little bit of a connection, because we kept seeing each other, like, why are you here? Why are you here? You know what I mean? We see each other in town, and we became familiar. And he said, man, they call us every time there's a call. He said, I'm not sure why. He said, but you know what, it is what it is. He said, I get a lot of overtime because of it. I don't love it, but I'll take it. And that's what the defunding the police is about. There's no reason. There were times I was calling an ambulance for a student with a broken ankle in the recreation center. The ambulance shows up and the police show up right behind them. Like, what? And that's what the defunding the police is, because there's also a belief, and I'm, again, a believer. I have healthcare workers in the family on all levels, that our healthcare workers who helped us, like many other folks, get through this pandemic, are underpaid. You know what I mean? But when you have someone showing up, for a broken ankle, and you got the police there, and you're paying them overtime. I mean, and this is just a sample. Those are resources that you can allocate to better train, better prepare, and better equip our healthcare workers. You know what I mean?
Social workers. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's with a social worker or somebody like that, and that's the shifting of the resources that defunding the police, I think, was really attempting to get at, and that's how I saw it. That's how I received it. That's what the literature I read when you're talking about facts. You know what I mean? Um, Separate from my opinion, that's what the literature I read leaned it toward.
And you're
Was about.
absolutely right, Charles.
Hmm.
We explained, like, I kind of peeled it back to explain all of that. We're not saying we're saying let's talk about police reform, rather that police reform that includes community policing. Let's
Hmm.
talk about that instead of a literal defunding the police, because that's not what it means, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so we can't take that messaging and run away with it. We need the police. We
Right.
need element. We're also saying that we need police to be trained. We need police to have that sensitivity training when they run into certain neighborhoods, to understand the people
Right.
in that neighborhood.
Right.
We need,
Right.
so again we go back to the conversation. Can we have law and order and racial justice? And so
Exactly.
and so that's why I said one of the major things we do in the discussing opposing viewpoints, no matter how emotional we are, is look at the common ground. So when I ask questions that way, it came back to, yes, we can have both. And what does
Hmm.
both look like?
Right. Right. I mean, and that's a fantastic question. You know what I mean? Because when we dismantle, reorganize, whatever it is, the police force, we have to remember that the current organization, or the current institution of police has its origins in slave catchers in the 19th century. You,
There
you
you
know what
go.
I mean? So
There
we
you go.
gotta, you gotta, that has to be on the table. But to your point, Carolee, while we do have a need for police, what's the training look like? You have to go to
Right.
school for years to be an attorney. You know what I mean? You have to go to, school for almost the whole year to be a police officer in almost
Mm-hmm.
70% of the UK, and countries in Europe. Why do you only need about 2 months of training to be a police officer in one of the most densely populated, um, you know, cities with the widest gaps in socioeconomic status? Where's
Mm-hmm.
the culture? You know what I mean? And then be charged with knowing, interpreting, and enforcing law. Period. Just law.
Right.
You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? Let's
Mm-hmm.
start there, because the order is the other piece, which is the piece that really becomes problematic when they're trying to bring order to things that they themselves admit they're not trained to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Which is why I
Right.
think so many of the incidents turn violent, is because they're not prepared to engage in those spaces.
Right.
You know what
And
I
and and
mean?
and we have different, depending on the household that you come from, we have a different conversation with our young people about how they interact with the police. So
Hmm.
again, there was no equity there, or people didn't feel like, okay, so my friend does not have to have this conversation with his parents, but I
Hmm.
have to have this
Hmm.
conversation with my parents, right? And so what does that training look like? And then you have one political party,
Hmm.
the leader of one political party, that was saying pull down all racial sensitivity training in the civil service. Like, how can that be so? That's because you're not accepted that there is systemic racism, where
Hmm.
there is b- conscious or unconscious bias.
Right. Right. And we all have unconscious bias.
We
We all
all
have
do.
blind spots. You know what I mean? Because we are a product of our environments and our experiences. So, the idea that in a in a moment's notice, in a, you know, because fear is created. You
Mm-hmm.
know what I mean? Danger is real, but fear is not.
Right.
So when you're in a dangerous situation, you begin to think about all of those biases and process them, and that creates fear, which then creates negative outcomes. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And you can train people to be less afraid. And like you said, it doesn't, well, like I was saying, it doesn't change the danger level. But if there's a dangerous situation and I can approach it with less bias, like you said, then I can come to a better solution than
Right.
what's been happening. You know,
Mm-hmm.
but we can talk about this. And I'm sorry I went down this rabbit hole because we're supposed to be talking about the election.
Right, but this is the election because this is one of the major
Mm,
platforms that
mm,
party ran on. People people were also concerned about the coronavirus and the impact it had on the election. So whether you were someone who felt like it disproportionately affected our community, that would make you support one candidate because that candidate had a plan, whereas the other did not have a national plan.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so we looked at that as part of the platform. We also looked at, I asked students to look at, imagine these are candidates running for student government. Who would you vote for and why? Without even calling names. Who would you vote for? Which platform attracts you better and why? What's the
mhm,
messaging? And one of the major takeaway I got was, well, I prefer the candidate who has a plan. I prefer the candidate who looks like he's competent. I
mhm,
prefer the candidate who looks like my life matter because he's inclusively incorporating people with disabilities on the platform, people
mhm,
with people, black and brown people are
mhm,
included. People, age, when it comes to age, older people are included. And so I prefer the platform that is more inclusive. And I prefer the person who looks more competent. And I prefer the person who I can go to bed at night and not be worried about. And
mhm,
so it was the election. And so what I took away at the end of the day, and again, I put on my teacher's hat,
mhm,
is let's talk about information and disinformation, because a lot of that came up during this campaign and during this election. And when I remember, like, when I teach research courses, one of the major part that I spend time on, how
mhm.
do we evaluate our sources? We
Right.
are getting information
Mm,
from all over. How do we evaluate our sources? How do we know what is fact, what is fiction? How do we know what someone is using emotive appeal? I mean, there's nothing wrong with emotive appeal, but when you talk about another candidate is socialist or
right.
communist, what does that
Right.
mean? What does that even mean? And what on the candidate's platform that's saying he is supporting socialism or communism? And so it puts that fear, as you said, fear is built. And so we had
Mhm,
that long talk, and I said, we have to go back to the drawing board in colleges to teach students how to evaluate their sources. I used to tell my English students, there is a website that says William Shakespeare is a Black woman. Not everything that is written is real. Not everything that goes out there is real.
mhm,
Social media, for the most part, is not necessarily flagging everything or can keep up with the misinformation out there. And so I find if we're going to have our students or our young people civically engaged, especially as it comes on to elections, whether there be local elections or presidential elections, I need people to be more aware of messaging and more aware of information that has become disinformation. A foreign power meddled in our election in 2016, but I find that we didn't need a foreign power in 2020 because we were doing the same thing internally with the disinformation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you talk about something that, I think hits home in another way is the integrity of our election and the way the right has called it into question today, but in many ways, all but admitted that they benefited from it 4 years ago. In the same way that the same party threatened to pack the court if President Obama at the time nominated 10 months before the election a new justice to succeed, a justice who I believe had passed away. And now that they have had the opportunity to appoint multiple judges to the court, they condemn.
And they did it 8 days before the election.
But they now condemn packing the court, even though they threatened the same tactic so many years ago. You know what I mean? Just one election cycle ago, actually, when I think about it, it wasn't so many years ago, but they condemned the activity that they're now threatening us with.
The hypocrisy. And And as you talk about the election results, yes, we know formally elections, the election results are certified by each individual state, but based on data and based on science and based on math, networks have been projecting all modern national elections. And not only national elections, but the networks have been doing that. And so when the other side benefits from a projection, there is no call into, let's wait until the state certify it. But when it happens and you lose, it's like, okay, the election is rigged unless I'm winning.
Absolutely.
And that calls a lot of things in terms of integrity. How can we get people to really trust the process? If you're calling the election into question, right? If you're calling without evidence, it's like you're saying, all right, I lost my car, but let me go get evidence that I lost my car and somebody stole my car. So let me put it out there first. Somebody stole my car, but then let me go gather the evidence. It was so disheartening because now people don't trust the process. And it should be a small d democratic process that we all trust, and the institutions that we trust to make decisions that we can hold on and have confidence in. And so that, I'm glad you brought that up, Charles, because that's a big problem. Even though the race has been projected, it's really it's really up in the air and unsettled in some places, because you hear, we're going to challenge that. And there's no problem with challenging, but bring the evidence and we'll challenge it. Stop calling out, and I'm going to say this, minority cities. Stop saying, it was okay in some parts of Pennsylvania, the count that I got, but in Philadelphia, because it's a Black city, in Philadelphia, we know what goes on there. In Milwaukee, we know what goes on there. In Detroit, we know what goes on there. In Atlanta, we know what goes on there. Then what are you trying to say? That's a dog whistle. What are you trying to say? Is that the Black cities that voted for the other candidate, they cannot be trusted?
Right, right. I mean, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, because the truth of the matter is the voting system within each state is consistent. You know what
Right.
I mean?
Mhm.
Um, they might, they have the ability within separate counties to have things printed in a certain way, but the state is, and their voting is the process is consistent throughout each state. So New
Right.
York, all of New York votes one way, all of New Jersey votes one way. And I mean, and but we are inherently different. On election day, New York had voting machines. On
Right.
election day, New Jersey did not. Want to know why? Because we received mail-in ballots at the end of September with all the election information on it. And what I received in the mail was my official ballot. And the best way to get my vote counted as a citizen, and a resident, I should say, of the state of New Jersey, was to fill in my mail-in ballot and to take it someplace, to drop it off. Not even the post office. I could go to the post office, but they had drop-in boxes. When I went to the polling place, because we still have polling places, there were no voting machines. There were provisional ballots that I had to fill out.
Wow.
You know what I mean? And this is my
Mhm.
first time voting in New Jersey, so I didn't know what to expect. But that's how it was. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Hmm.
So the idea that, one county in Pennsylvania versus another county in Pennsylvania, you want to
It's
believe
counting
in
differently.
those.
Hmm.
Yeah, you want to believe in those, but not believe in the other
Hmm.
is seriously a bad joke. You
And
know what I mean?
seriously, dog whistle, because
Absolutely,
we know who is in Philadelphia. We know
absolutely.
we know the majority of the people in Philadelphia, and because they supported the other candidate. And so
Right,
it has this impact, or it has
right,
ramifications, because now if we can't trust the integrity of our most basic democratic process, then how
right.
are we going to trust a vaccine that is coming out to save our lives?
Listen, we just got the 5-minute warning here in the chat, but like I said, this is another topic that we can talk about for
Forever.
because the current sitting president, though he should really be lame duck at this point in time, just terminated the Secretary of Defense.
Yes.
Supposedly, and this is, I haven't had a chance to your point, fact checked all of this, is because he wouldn't allow him to leverage the armed forces to push the vaccine, or to get engaged and involved,
On the
um,
streets. Hmm.
on the streets, regarding protesters and the election. He wanted
Right.
like military forces out there, you know, ensuring that the election is happening. And in addition to telling his followers that they had a right, which they don't, to watch people count the votes. You
Right.
know what I mean? So
So
anyway,
we have
Carolee,
politicized everything, Charles.
absolutely, but I want to thank you. This was a fantastic conversation.
Thank
Um,
you.
Never realized how much time we had until we got our 5-minute warning in the chat.
Oh,
So thank you, LJ, for letting us know
thank
where
you.
we are. Like I said, Carol, this was fantastic. Really do appreciate your insight, and more importantly, your work with students on these topics, because it's important.
It's important. Thank you so very much. And thanks to everyone who has joined us today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Grizzlies, to close, I want to thank you, either having watched it live, or if you're going to check it out later on YouTube. It is absolutely my pleasure to be here on a bi-weekly basis now, but more importantly, to serve as your vice president for student engagement. As always, I want to thank those of you that are essential workers that work in healthcare. Because without you, we would not have made it this far through the pandemic. And I want to take this time, to just give my thoughts and prayers to those of you who may have lost someone or know someone who has lost someone, as the United States alone has lost over 250,000 people, to COVID-19. We spent a lot of time today talking about uh, the results of the election, the impact of the social movement. And I want to thank you all for engaging in the democratic process, as Ms. Ramsey said, small d democratic process, because it's important. And I want you to know that we continue to advocate for those of us that have not yet been given that opportunity to participate in the election, and know that everyone is welcome at Gutman. We have all of your backs, and we're here to support you and ensure that we are here to help you build towards your academic success, and that you have an opportunity and a funnel to get civically engaged. As I said, I'm wearing a Teach, Hustle, Inspire t-shirt. My
Mhm.
hope is that maybe today, if that you had an opportunity to learn something from me or from Ms. Ramsey, that you can see how hard we're working, how much we're trying to hustle so that we can bring to you quality programs and information. But most importantly, I hope we inspire you to engage. We inspire you to vote and to participate in your communities and surrounding areas. Grizzlies, I always say, we got your back. It's a pleasure again to be here, and it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to have a platform to have these discussions. So once again, Carolee, thank you for your
Thank you.
time, your energy. Today was truly great, and Grizzlies, we'll see you. Even though my usual partner in crime is not here, we had a more
His
than
face is
fantastic
here.
step in. Yeah, we can still see him. But we'll see you in 2 weeks, same bat time, same bat channel. I have to do both parts of it. Grizzlies, it's an honor. Take care, and we'll see you soon.